When we think of Rome, our minds are filled with images of marble columns glowing under the Mediterranean sun, vast amphitheaters echoing with the cheers of citizens, and grand processions along the forum where emperors once paraded their power. Rome, the eternal city, has always been presented to us as a monument to triumph, order, and civilization. Yet beneath the polished surface of this narrative lies another Rome, one woven with shadows, secrets, and questions that history has never fully answered. It is this darker, quieter Rome that drifts like a ghost beneath the grandeur, and it is into this dreamlike world that we now step. The city we know today sits gently upon the layers of its own past, like a palimpsest of stone. Modern streets and piazzas rest above ruins buried silently in the earth. At night, when the crowds grow thinner and the chatter of tourists fades, one can almost hear the faint murmurs of the centuries beneath the cobblestones. Every archway, every fragment of brick, carries with an echo of lives once lived, of mysteries never solved, of whispers that still ripple through time. Walking through Rome in the moonlight feels like stepping into a city that is both alive and asleep, a place where the line between fact and legend blurs, and where history itself becomes a haunting companion. This is not the Rome of textbooks alone, filled with neat timelines and tidy accounts of emperors and battles. Instead, this is a Rome where whole legions disappeared without explanation, where poisons were slipped into cups in candlelit dining rooms, where emperors danced with madness, and where secret religions thrived in the shadows. It is a Rome of curses carved into gravestones, of fires that devoured entire districts, of mysterious books of prophecy consulted and then lost forever. For every marble temple that survives, there are countless unanswered questions hidden in the silence beneath. And perhaps it is this silence that draws us closer, urging us to lean in, to listen carefully, to wonder what has been lost in the long river of time. Rome has always been a city of contrasts. It was at once the most powerful empire in the world and a fragile collection of fears and superstitions. It was the birthplace of laws and order, yet also of rumor, betrayal, and the kind of secrecy that slips into legend. It is this contrast between the known and the unknown, between the bright sunlight of triumph and the deep shadows of uncertainty, that makes Rome's mysteries so compelling. To study them is not only to learn about history, but also to feel the pulse of something timeless, something human, the fear of the unknown, the allure of the forbidden, and the endless curiosity about what lies hidden just beyond reach. As we drift into this journey, imagine standing at the heart of the Forum at night. The ruins rise around you, fragments of columns reaching into the starlit sky, arches half-shattered but still proud. In the stillness, you feel both very small and very connected, as though the stones themselves are watching. Somewhere beneath your feet, deep underground, lie temples that were buried centuries ago, their walls painted with colors that no sunlight has touched for over 1,000 years. Beyond them, catacombs stretch like veins through the earth, filled with bones, frescoes, and secrets locked in silence. And above, on the hills, stand palaces where once emperor conspired and lovers whispered under torchlight, where laughter mixed with plotting, and where shadows sometimes spoke louder than words. To enter Rome's darkest mysteries is to walk this layered city not as a tourist, but as a listener. Each mystery is like a faint bell ringing from a distant past, a call across the centuries. Some are tied to great events, fires, assassinations, vanished armies, while others belong to the private fears of ordinary people, ghosts in the night, curses carved into stone, omens glimpsed in the sky. Taken together, they form a hidden history, one not taught in schools but whispered in fragments through letters, inscriptions, and half-forgotten tales. In the quiet hours of evening, when our minds grow softer and our hearts more open, such stories take on a special life. They feel less like facts to be memorized and more like dreams that drift toward us, carrying the fragrance of antiquity. And though historians often try to separate fact from fable, here we allow them to mingle. For in the space between truth and imagination, in the gentle twilight between what we know and what we cannot know, lies a mystery that makes Rome eternal. This exploration will not be a march of dry dates and facts. Instead, it will be a slow unfolding, like walking through narrow Roman streets that suddenly open into hidden courtyards. We will move from one mystery to the next, pausing to reflect, to sense the atmosphere, to imagine what it must have felt like to live in those moments of uncertainty. We will travel from vanished legions to poisoned chalices, from haunted houses to secret cults, always guided by the same current, the eternal question of what remains unseen. And yet, Even as we seek these answers, we must accept that Rome's greatest gift to us is not its clarity, but its ambiguity. For if everything were known, the city would lose its magic. It is precisely because we cannot be sure, because so many questions remain, that Rome still feels alive in ways that defy explanation. The mysteries endure not to be solved completely, but to remind us that history is not a closed book. It is a living presence, whispering still in the arches, the stones, and the shadows. So let us begin with quiet minds and open hearts. Let us drift with the Tiber as it winds gently through the city, reflecting moonlight off its waters. Let us walk softly into the darkness of Rome's past, where stories are both history and lullaby, fact and fable, certainty and dream. The eternal city awaits, not the Rome of daylight, but the Rome of twilight, where shadows tell their own tales. Among the countless mysteries that ripple through the history of Rome, few have the same haunting power as the fate of the 9th Legion Hispana. This was no minor unit forgotten in the margins of dusty scrolls. It was a legion of hardened men, forged in fire, marked by victories across the empire, and proud to carry the eagle standard that embodied Rome itself. And yet, in the early 2nd century, this proud legion seems to slip silently from the historical record, vanish without fanfare, without explanation, without so much as a definitive note in the annals of Rome. For centuries, scholars, soldiers, and storytellers alike have puzzled over this disappearance, weaving theories that blend fact with mystery, much like the shadows of Rome itself. The 9th Legion had a long and storied history. Raised during the time of Julius Caesar, it marched through the brutal campaigns of the Gallic Wars. The Legion endured mutinies, fought civil wars, and later played a decisive role in Britain, where the Roman presence was always uneasy and contested. Stationed at Eboracum, modern-day York, the 9th was tasked with holding a frontier that was never truly tamed. To the north lay lands Rome never fully conquered, wild expanses where tribes resisted fiercely, blending into forests and marshes. The Legion, perhaps weary from years of conflict, must have felt the weight of isolation at the edge of the known world. Then, quite suddenly, the record grows quiet. Historians know that by around 120 A.D., the 9th Legion disappears from the official rolls. No inscriptions mark a continued presence. No victories are attributed to it. The silence is as loud as the sound of a great door closing. For an empire that prided itself on meticulous record-keeping, where even minor details of supply and discipline were etched into stone, such an absence feels less like oversight and more like deliberate erasure, or perhaps the result of something too unsettling to be fully recorded. One of the most enduring theories is that the 9th was destroyed in Britain, overwhelmed in a catastrophic defeat at the hands of northern tribes. In this imagining, thousands of Roman soldiers marched into the misty forest beyond Hadrian's eventual wall and never returned. The eagle standard, that sacred symbol of Roman might, may have been seized by the victors, its gleam extinguished in the mud of Britain's dark soil. The silence of Rome's records would then make sense. The empire, humiliated, might have preferred to bury the memory of such a loss rather than broadcast its vulnerability. But others argue differently. Some point out faint traces that suggest the 9th may have been transferred elsewhere, perhaps to the Rhine or even to the east, where Rome's borders are forever under pressure. A few inscriptions hint at legionaries of the 9th in distant provinces, though whether these were remnants or entirely different detachments remains unclear. If the Legion did move, why was its later history not recorded with the care Rome normally gave to such matters? Was it destroyed not in Britain but in some other forgotten clash on the edges of empire? Or did it slowly dwindle, broken into fragments, until its identity as a single, proud unit dissolved into nothingness? The mystery lingers not only in historical documents, but also in the imagination of those who came centuries later. In the 20th century, the tale of the 9th was revived in novels and films, capturing the fascination of audiences who saw in it the archetypal story of men swallowed by wilderness and time. To this day, visitors to York may stand among the ruins of Roman walls and wonder, did the Legion's footsteps echo here for the last time before fading forever into silence? The very absence of clarity makes the story resonate more deeply, for it allows the mind to wander into the mist, imagining doomed marches, ambushes in shadowy forests, or secret reassignment followed by slow erasure. The 9th's disappearance is not simply a story of military loss. It is a reminder how fragile even the strongest powers can be. Rome, the conqueror of the Mediterranean world, could lose not only men but memory. The silence in the records is itself a kind of ghost, a presence haunting the absence. For those who lived at the time, the loss of a legion was more than statistics. It was thousands of fathers, brothers, sons, all gone. It was also the loss of Rome's pride, the sting of defeat on soil it had claimed as its own. As we listen softly to this mystery, we are invited to reflect on how empires manage memory. Victories are carved into stone, while defeats are buried in silence. Yet silence does not erase, it only deepens the shadows. The Ninth Legion survives in whispers, in speculations, in stories retold across centuries. And perhaps this is fitting. A legion that once marched so proudly now moves forever in the twilight between fact and legend, a reminder that no empire, however great, can fully control the narrative of its own past. To imagine their fate is to hear the faint echo of boots in the mist, the clash of weapons, the final cries fading into forests where Roman discipline met the raw wildness of the north. Or perhaps it is to picture them far from Britain, crossing deserts or rivers, swallowed not by a single battle but by the long erosion of time. However the Ninth met its end, the mystery remains a mirror of Rome itself, powerful, disciplined, yet ultimately vulnerable to the great silences of history. And as we leave this legion in the midst of speculation, we turn gently to another shadowed corner of Rome's past. If soldiers could vanish, what of emperors and nobles living in the glittering world of palaces and banquets? For Rome was not only haunted by disappearances on the battlefield, but also by quieter, more intimate deaths. Poison slipped into golden cups, plots whispered in the dark. Where the nine fell to silence, others fell to secrecy, and so we drift now into the shadowed world of Rome's poisoned chalices and imperial intrigue. In the heart of Rome, where marble palaces glittered in torchlight and banquets stretched late into the night, power was never secure. The same halls that echoed with laughter, music, and the clinking of golden goblets also carried the low hum of conspiracy. Hey, death could come not with the clash of swords or the roar of battle, but silently, invisibly, in the form of a bitter drop dissolved into wine or hidden in a lavish dish. To eat and drink in Rome's highest circles was to step into a theater of risk. Every banquet was both a performance of luxury and a test of trust. In the end, perhaps no one in Rome was ever truly safe, not even emperors. The Romans were no strangers to poison. From the earliest days of the Republic, whispers of secret mixtures and deadly brews haunted the city. Some claim that Rome's first great poisoning panic erupted in the 3rd century BC, when nearly 200 noble women were accused of conspiring to murder their husbands with potions. Whether this was fact or rumor, the tale reveals a deep unease that poison stirred in Roman minds. Unlike the visible dangers of war or assassination by blade, poison was an enemy hidden in plain sight, striking without warning and leaving few traces. It was a weapon of intimacy, used not on the battlefield, but at the dinner table. By the time of the emperors, poison had become almost synonymous with palace intrigue. Stories swirl around Augustus, Rome's first emperor, whose careful consolidation of power was shadowed by suspicious deaths. His heir, Marcellus, died young, some said from poison slipped into his food. His stepson Drusus, too, perished suddenly, and whispers pointed to a poisoned apple given by his ambitious wife, Livilla. Whether true or not, such tales spread easily in a society where fear was constant and ambition could be fatal. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, with all its grandeur, became a theater of toxic suspicion. Livia, Augustus' wife, was both revered and feared. Some later historians suggested she poisoned rivals to ensure her son Tiberius' rise to power. The image of a stately Roman matron, quietly steering the fate of the empire with subtle doses of venom, became part of Rome's mythology. Whether history has exaggerated or not, the fact remains, the association of poison with women, plots, and family feuds took root deeply in the Roman imagination. And then came Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, whose name is forever bound with intrigue. It was said that she herself survived multiple attempts on her life, and returned the favor with calculated skill. When her husband, Emperor Claudius, died suddenly after eating mushrooms, the city whispered that Agrippina had arranged it, ensuring that her son Nero ascended the throne. The phrase, the mushroom of the emperor, became a bitter joke, Rome's dark humor acknowledging its fear. In a world where emperors commanded armies and shaped the destiny of millions, their lives could be ended not by force of arms, but by something as delicate as a meal. The truth of these accounts is difficult to know. Roman historians often shape their stories to fit moral lessons, exaggerating or inventing poisonings to highlight corruption, ambition, or the decline of values. Yet the persistence of the theme tells us something real about the atmosphere of the time. Banquets, once symbols of Roman abundance, became stages of uncertainty. The richer and more powerful a person was, the more guarded they had to be at their own table. Food tasters, trusted slaves, and ritual precautions were all meant to guard against invisible threats, but paranoia seeped through the walls of every villa and palace. Poison was not only a tool of personal ambition, it was also a symbol of Rome's darker contradictions. Here was a civilization that built aqueducts, roads, and systems of law, yet lived in constant fear of unseen betrayal. The same empire that prided itself on order and strength was undone, again and again, by suspicions of drops of liquid or powders stirred into wine. And perhaps it was this very contrast that made poison such a powerful cultural motif. Where the sword was bold and open, poison was hidden and silent. Where armies clashed in glory, poisoners worked in shadows. It was a dark reflection of Rome's brilliance. For the people of the city, stories of poisonings also carried a strange fascination. They were retold as cautionary tales, whispered as gossip, embroidered into theater. To imagine an emperor's life hanging on the contents of a dish was both terrifying and strangely thrilling. It made even the most powerful figures seem vulnerable, as though the empire itself could crumble not from foreign invasion but from a single drop of venom at a feast. One cannot help but wonder about the atmosphere of those banquets. Imagine reclining in a candlelit room, surrounded by rich tapestries, hearing music and laughter, while trays of exotic foods and wine circulate. Outwardly, it is the height of luxury, yet beneath the surface, every bite might carry danger. Did the diners glance at each other, watching carefully, wary of who raised a cup first, who hesitated, who looked too intently at their plate? Did emperors taste bitterness that was not there, their minds already poisoned by suspicion long before their bodies were touched? The psychology of poison was perhaps as potent as the substance itself. Fear could weaken trust, create divisions, and gnaw at the heart of relationships. In an empire built on loyalty of soldiers, of senators, of families, such doubt was corrosive. Whether or not every story of poisoning was true, the belief in poison's presence was enough to shape behavior, decisions, and even destiny. And so, the poisoned chalice becomes more than just a historical curiosity. It becomes a metaphor for Rome itself, glittering on the outside, but with shadows lurking beneath the surface. The empire was a banquet laid out for the world, filled with riches and wonders, yet always at risk of being undone from within by forces subtle, hidden, and unseen. As we leave the table where golden cups glisten with danger, we drift toward another aspect of Rome's relationship with death and fear. For poison was not the only invisible force haunting the city. Beyond the walls of palaces and villas lay tombs and cemeteries, guarded by curses and superstitions. Rome's fear of the unseen extended even into the realm of the dead, where disturbing a grave might bring a fate worse than poison. And so, we turn now to the mysteries of curses, tombs, and the forbidden dead, where silence and shadow deepen even further. Death was everywhere in Rome. It lingered in the crowded streets where disease spread easily, in the arenas where blood soaked the sand, and in the endless wars that carried Roman soldiers to distant lands. Yet for all its familiarity, death was never fully at peace in the Roman imagination. To the living, the dead were both sacred and dangerous. They were honored with rituals and offerings, yet also feared as restless presences that could rise to torment the living. It was in this twilight space, between reverence and dread, that the Romans developed their strange relationship with tombs, curses, and the forbidden arts of the dead. Roman tombs were not simply resting places. They were powerful symbols, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Families carefully prepared graves, marking them with inscriptions that told the story of the deceased, but often these stones carried more than words of remembrance. Many bore curses, fierce warnings against anyone who dared to disturb the grave or steal offerings left for the departed. These were not idle threats. The Romans believed the spirits of the dead, manes, shades that linger beyond the grave, could take vengeance if disrespected. To violate a tomb was to invite a curse not just upon yourself but upon your family, your health, and even your soul. Inscriptions unearthed by archaeologists reveal this ancient fear in stark language. One gravestone warns, whoever violates this tomb may be destroyed utterly, and may the spirits of the dead pursue him. Another demands that violators suffer the wrath of the underworld gods, condemned to wander without peace. These curses were carved into stone as a way of extending the reach of the dead, ensuring their rest was protected not only by law but by supernatural dread. Imagine walking among the tombs along the Appian Way at dusk, the marble glimmering faintly in the fading light, knowing that every marker carried a threat whispered from the other side. Yet despite these warnings, tombs were often disturbed. Rome was a city where greed could outweigh fear, and grave goods, coins, jewelry, even the stone itself, were tempting prizes. Necromancy, too, drew desperate people into the forbidden world of the dead. There were those who believed the shades of the departed could be summoned, questioned, and compelled to reveal secrets. In hushed rituals, magicians mixed herbs, chanted spells, and opened grave in hopes of glimpsing knowledge beyond the mortal realm. Such practices were condemned by law and custom, but their persistence tells us how deeply the Romans longed to control fate, even if it meant defying the sacred rest of the dead. Curses were not limited to tombs. Across the empire, archaeologists have discovered thousands of depictions, curse tablets. These thin sheets of lead were inscribed with names, pleas, and invocations to dark powers, then folded and buried in graves, wells, or sanctuaries. They might call for an enemy's business to fail, for a rival's love to turn sour, or for justice against a thief. Some were even nailed to the coffins of the recently deceased, the restless spirits pressed into service as messengers of vengeance. To read these tablets today is to hear the intimate voices of ordinary Romans, people who felt powerless in life and sought strength through the mysteries of death. One tablet discovered in Britain curses a thief. May he who has stolen my cloak lose his mind and his eyes until he returns it. Another, found in Athens, calls upon underworld deities to bind the tongue of an opponent in court. There is something deeply human in these fragile inscriptions, petty, fearful, and yet achingly familiar. They remind us that while emperors plotted on grand scales, ordinary Romans whispered their own hopes and hatreds into the silence of the grave. The forbidden nature of these practices only made them more alluring. Necromancy was a crime, but stories of magicians raising the dead were told with a mixture of horror and fascination. The poet Lucan describes a chilling scene in which a witch forces a corpse to speak, its mouth spilling truths it should never have uttered. Whether such accounts were exaggerations or not, they capture the Roman sense that the dead were never entirely gone. They lingered, waiting, capable of being disturbed, and capable of disturbing in return. Even Rome's great leaders could not escape this fate. Emperors built elaborate mausoleums, not just as monuments to their glory, but as fortresses against desecration. The mausoleum of Augustus, vast and imposing, was meant to secure his body for eternity. Yet as the centuries passed, even imperial tombs were violated, their treasures stolen, their bodies scattered. Not even the most powerful man in the world could guarantee peace after death. The fragility of rest haunted the Roman imagination, reminding them that power ended at the grave, and even there, shadows might stare. Walking today through the catacombs beneath Rome, one can feel this mingling of fear and reverence. The walls are carved with names, prayers, and symbols, a testament to the longing for eternal rest. Yet the narrow tunnels, the darkness, the silence heavy with centuries, all of it evokes unease. It is easy to imagine the old Roman belief that the dead are not always still, that curses still linger in the air, waiting for those who disturb their slumber. What makes these stories so compelling is not simply their strangeness, but their reflection of a universal truth. Death unsettles us. It draws both reverence and dread. We honor our dead, yet we fear their return. We long for peace, yet we cannot resist the temptation to reach beyond the veil, to seek answers from those who have already crossed. In ancient Rome, this tension manifested in stone curses, in lead tablets, in forbidden rituals whispered at midnight. And perhaps this is why the Romans' relationship with death still speaks to us. It was not tidy or resolved. It was filled with contradictions, love and fear, reverence and violation, hope and dread. Their tombs remind us that even civilizations as powerful as Rome were humbled by mortality. Their curses remind us that fear of betrayal, greed, and revenge can reach beyond life itself. Their necromancies remind us that the desire to know the unknown is as old as humanity. As we step away from the tombs and the whispered curses, another shadow beckons. Death could come silently through poison, or it could be invoked by the disturbed dead, but sometimes it came with fire, swift, devouring, impossible to control. Our next mystery carries us into the streets of Rome as flames rise to the sky, consuming marble and wood alike, and leaving behind a question that has never been fully answered. We turn now to the fire that devoured Rome, and the secrets hidden in its smoke. It began in the night. A spark, a flicker of flame in the narrow, overcrowded streets of Rome. At first, it must have seemed like just another fire, common in a city where wooden tenements lean precariously against one another, and where oil lamps, cooking fires, and torches made every alley a tinderbox. But on that hot July evening in the year 64 CE, the flames did not fade. They grew. They leapt across roofs and swept through markets. They howled with the wind, climbing higher and higher until Rome itself seemed to burn with the rage of the gods. The great fire of Rome lasted for 9 long days. In that time, entire districts were reduced to ash. Temples, homes, and monuments vanished in the blaze. Families fled into the open fields, clutching what little they could save. The historian Tacitus tells us of the chaos, the smoke that blotted out the sky, the screams of the trapped, the desperate cries of those who lost everything. Rome, the eternal city, was being devoured before their eyes. When the flames finally died, the devastation was almost unimaginable. 2/3 of the city had been destroyed. For those who walked among the ruins, the destruction felt like an omen, as if the gods themselves had turned against Rome. But the question that haunted survivors was not only why it happened, but who had started it. Whispers spread quickly, and the whispers carried a name: Nero. Emperor Nero was one of the most infamous rulers in Roman history, a man both adored and despised. To his admirers, he was a patron of the arts, a man who fancied himself an actor, musician, and visionary. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, self-indulgent, cruel, and increasingly detached from reality. It is said that as the city burned, Nero watched from a safe distance, playing his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. Whether this story is fact or legend remains unclear, but it captured the imagination of Rome, a symbol of an emperor who seemed to revel in his people's suffering. Tacitus himself doubted the rumor that Nero played music while the city burned, noting that he was likely away at Antium when the fire first broke out. But perception mattered more than truth. To the people of Rome, it seemed all too believable. Nero had long dreamed of remaking the city, sweeping away its cramped and filthy streets to build a new Rome in his image. And indeed, after the fire, he set to work. The ruins gave him a blank canvas, and upon it he began constructing the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace so vast and opulent that it stretched across the heart of the city. Inside its halls were marble chambers, fountains, gardens, and even a colossal statue of himself. To the homeless masses huddling in makeshift shelters, Nero's shining palace was not a gift, but a theft, their misery transformed into his monument. Accusations grew louder. Had Nero ordered the fire? Had he sent men to spread the flame so his vision of a new Rome could rise from the ashes? Some accounts claim that groups of men, loyal to Nero, were seen throwing torches and blocking attempts to put out the blaze. Whether these stories were true or fueled by rage and grief, they cemented the suspicion that the emperor himself had set Rome alight. Faced with mounting anger, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in the growing sect of Christians. To many Romans, Christians were strange, secretive, and dangerous. They rejected the gods, refused to worship the emperor, and held their rituals in private. Already mistrusted, they became the perfect target. Nero accused them of setting the fire, and what followed was one of the earliest and most brutal persecutions of Christians in history. Men, women, and children were rounded up, tortured, and executed in grotesque displays meant to satisfy both vengeance and spectacle. Some were torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. And in perhaps the most horrifying act, some were covered in pitch, tied to stakes, and set ablaze to serve as human torches in Nero's gardens at night. The fire had consumed Rome, but Nero ensured it consumed his enemies as well. Yet the fire remained shrouded in mystery. Did Nero truly order it, or was he merely guilty of opportunism, using the destruction to shape the city as he wished? Some historians suggest the fire was simply an accident, inevitable in a city so crowded and combustible. Others see in it a deliberate act of political theater, a ruler willing to sacrifice his people for his dreams of grandeur. The truth may never be known. What is certain is that the fire transformed Nero's reputation forever. Even centuries later, he would be remembered not as a builder of Rome, but as the emperor who watched while it burned. The aftermath of the fire also reshaped the city itself. From the ashes rose new laws, new streets, and new architecture designed to prevent such a disaster from happening again. Wider roads, stricter building codes, and fire brigade became part of the urban fabric. In this way, the fire was both tragedy and rebirth. Rome, wounded and scarred, began again. But the shadow of suspicion lingered. The fire had revealed something dark about power, about how leaders could use catastrophe to tighten their grip, about how suffering could be turned into spectacle. Standing in the ruins, one can imagine the survivors picking through the charred remains of their homes, mourning their dead, staring at the half-fallen temples of their gods. They must have wondered not only how the fire had started, but whether Rome itself was cursed, whether the empire's growing arrogance had drawn down divine wrath. The city would rise again, but it would never be the same. The Great Fire was more than an event. It was a story of hubris, fear, and the fragile line between order and chaos. It revealed the vulnerability of even the mightiest empire and the dangerous lengths to which power might go to preserve itself. And as the smoke cleared, one truth remained. In Rome, fire could cleanse, but it could also consume, leaving behind only ash, suspicion, and the faint sound of music carried on the wind. But fire was not the only silent killer in Rome. If flames threatened the city from without, poison stalked its holes from within. Our next journey takes us into the heart of intrigue and betrayal, to the feasts, the chalices, and the whispered toast where a single sip could mean death. In the courts of Rome, power was never secure. Alliances shifted like sand, and loyalty could be bought, broken, or betrayed with frightening ease. Armies and legions decided wars on the battlefield, but in the shadowy corridors of the Palatine Hill, battles were fought in quieter, deadlier ways. Hey, politics did not always end with the thrust of a sword. More often, it ended with a cup of wine. To the Romans, poison was a weapon of the hidden hand. A dagger left blood on the floor, a scream in the air, a body in public view. Poison left nothing but silence and suspicion. It was a tool of whispers, of calculated vengeance, of ambitions carried out without raising alarms. In the flicker of candlelight at a feast, in the clink of goblets at a celebration, one sip could bring triumph or destruction. Some of the most chilling tales from Rome's long history are bound to this theme of poisoned chalices. Consider Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, a woman described by ancient writers as ruthless, cunning, and insatiable in her thirst for influence. Agrippina had watched power slip through the hands of others, and she had learned that survival in Rome required more than charm or beauty. It required a willingness to strike before being struck. Many believe that she turned to poison as her secret ally. Her rival Claudius, the emperor, and her own husband became her most infamous victim. According to several accounts, Agrippina ensured his death by poisoning a dish of mushrooms, one of his favorites. The emperor fell ill and died, leaving the throne open for Nero, her son, who she guided like a puppet. If true, the act was both personal and political, a reminder how a single meal could change the course of empire. Rome itself teetered on the balance of a plate of mushrooms, and its destiny shifted with each poisoned bite. But Agrippina was not alone in wielding such weapons. In fact, an entire network of poisoners seemed to thrive in Rome. Chief among them was a woman named Locusta, a professional poisoner whose name became notorious throughout the empire. She was said to have been employed by the imperial family itself, creating concoctions so subtle, so deadly, that her victims never saw their end coming. Locusta was no shadowy myth. She was captured, tried, and pardoned more than once, always protected by powerful patrons who found her services too valuable to lose. In this way, poison in Rome was both a crime and a craft. The art of creating poisons, many believed, was nearly scientific, perfected through experiments on slaves, animals, and prisoners. Hemlock, aconite, belladonna, and arsenic, these were just some of the deadly tools that had passed through the hands of Rome's silent killers. And yet, the true recipes were always cloaked in secrecy. Like rumors themselves, poisons thrived in half-truths and shadows. There is a chilling paradox here. Rome prided itself on law, order, and justice. And yet in its highest ranks, the same men and women who delivered speeches about honor and loyalty might secretly commission the brewing of a cup of death. The Senate debated openly in its chambers, while in the dining halls of palaces, another politics played out, an invisible politics measured not in votes, but in drops. This culture of fear transformed even the most ordinary rituals. Sharing a meal, once a sign of friendship and community, became a delicate act of trust. Historians note that emperors often employed food tasters, slaves or officials whose sole job was to take the first bite or sip to prove the meal was safe. Imagine the unease of such dinners: golden platters of roasted meat, bowls of fruit, cups of the finest wine, all carried in with ceremony, yet laced with the possibility of betrayal. Every toast was a gamble, every bite a test of faith. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that poison blurred the line between natural death and murder. An emperor who fell suddenly ill might simply have succumbed to disease, or he might have been silently erased by those closest to him. How many deaths in Rome's long history were truly natural? How many were engineered by poison, master's fate? The sources rarely agree, and the truth is often lost between accusation and denial. What is undeniable is that poison symbolized the nature of Roman power itself. Just as poison worked invisibly, striking without warning, so too did the dangers of ambition. No one, no matter how secure, was beyond reach. Poison reminded Rome that the greatest threats came not from enemies at the gates, but from the hands of family, friends, and supposed allies. Even the emperors, masters of the known world, were not immune. Stories of Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and even later rulers are all marked by suspicions of poison. In the case of Caligula, whispers suggest that his paranoia was fueled not only by political rivals but by the constant fear that his meals could betray him. Claudius's death, whether by mushrooms or not, is forever clouded in suspicion. Nero himself would one day meet an unnatural end, not by poison, but by the blade, as rebellion closed in. Still, poison haunted him too, as both tool and threat throughout his reign. When we reflect on this shadowy chapter of Roman history, the contrast is striking. Rome, with its triumphal arches, its soaring forums, its endless conquests, seemed so outwardly strong. And yet beneath the marble and the glory, life could be ended in silence, in secrecy, in something as ordinary as a drink. It is a reminder that true danger often wears no armor, no weapon, no visible face. It waits quietly, dressed in ritual, carried on a tray, hidden in the sweetness of wine. And so, in the banquet halls of emperors and senators, Rome's fate was often decided without fanfare. No battles, no riots, no processions of victory. Just a quiet passing of a cup, the lifting of a chalice, and the final swallow that ended a life. But while poison could strike the powerful, Rome's darker mysteries were not confined to palaces and courts. There were other fears that stirred in the city, fears of curses, omens, and forces unseen. For if poison was a human weapon, curses seemed to reach beyond the mortal realm. And in Rome, curses had a power all their own. In the bustling streets and markets of Rome, where merchants bartered, lovers whispered, and priests offered sacrifices to the gods, another, quieter practice thrived. It did not take place in temples open to the sun, nor in the public squares where orators raised their voices. Instead, it hid in the shadows, secretive, personal, and charged with both fear and hope. These were the curses of Rome, inscribed not in grand marble, but in thin sheets of lead, folded tightly, pierced with nails, and buried where no eye could see. To the modern mind, a curse may seem like superstition, an echo of childish fears or folklore. But in Rome, curses, known as the fictions, were a deeply serious affair. They were the intersection of religion, magic, and justice, invoked by those who felt powerless before the weight of fate. A man cheated in business, a woman abandoned by a lover, an athlete desperate to win, or even a politician threatened by rivals. Each might turn to a curse tablet, believing that with the right words and the right rituals, they could call upon dark forces to bend the world to their will. The process was simple, yet shrouded in ritual. A thin sheet of lead, malleable and cheap, was taken in hand. Upon it, the cursor inscribed their plea, sometimes carefully, with neat letters, sometimes hastily, as if fear or anger drove the hand. The words themselves were not gentle petitions. They were commands, fierce and uncompromising, calling upon gods, demons, and spirits of the underworld to act against the target. Names were written again and again, to bind the person fully. In some cases, little figurines representing the cursor were pierced with nails and buried alongside the tablets, a chilling image of symbolic torture meant to strengthen the spell. Many of these tablets have survived, unearthed centuries later from wells, graves, and beneath temples. They whisper across time, voices of ordinary Romans whose fears and desires are preserved in metal. One tablet might curse a thief, demanding that he be plagued until stolen goods are returned. Another might call for a rival charioteer to crash in the circus, his horses tangled, his hands broken. Lovers often turn to curses too, beseeching dark forces to inflame passion, or, more ominously, to destroy the rivals who stood in the way of affection. What is striking is the tone of these curses. They are not always wild or frenzied. Many are coldly practical, legalistic almost, as if the cursor were writing a contract with the divine. Some are surprisingly detailed, describing the exact harm desired, bind the tongue, the hands, the feet, the mind. Others are vague, leaving the punishment to the judgment of the gods. But all carried the same intent: to shift fate, to reach beyond the realm of human law into the realm of shadow. To deposit the tablet, the practitioner often sought liminal spaces, places that straddled the boundary between worlds. Wells, with their depth and connection to unseen waters, were popular. Graves, too, were favored, as the dead were thought to hold power to carry messages into the underworld. Sometimes, temples themselves became repositories, where curses could be hidden near altars, mingling the sacred and the profane. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these lead tablets is their universality. They were not the tools of emperors alone, nor the weapons of senators. They belonged to everyone. The poor could not hire assassins or buy legions, but they could inscribe a curse. A shopkeeper might curse a dishonest competitor. A slave might curse a cruel master. In this way, curses became a form of invisible power, an equalizer in a world that was otherwise deeply unequal. The Romans themselves lived with a constant awareness of these hidden weapons. To be cursed was to live under an invisible shadow. Illness, failure, or sudden misfortune could all be blamed on unseen hands moving through the words carved into lead. Even if one did not believe in their power, the knowledge that someone had wished such things upon you must have carried its own heavy dread. And here lies a strange paradox. Rome was a society of laws, of senators and courts, of judges and decrees. Yet alongside these structures, in the private spaces of kitchens and bedrooms, a parallel system of justice thrived, written not on scrolls but on tablets of lead. To live in Rome was to live between two systems, the visible, ordered world of law, and the hidden, shadowed world of curses. For us today, discovering these tablets and excavations, the effect is eerie. They are personal, intimate, sometimes almost desperate. Unlike marble inscriptions meant for the public eye, these were never intended to be read by others. They were secret messages cast into darkness, preserved by accident, and uncovered centuries later. In their sharp letters, one can still feel the pulse of fear, anger, love, and longing that once drove a Roman hand to carve them. Yet for all their secrecy, curses reveal something profound about Roman life. They show us a world where the boundary between religion and magic, between law and superstition, was far thinner than we might imagine. They remind us that even in a city of grandeur, humans sought hidden means to control their fates. And they hint at the deep unease that lingered beneath Rome's confidence, the belief that unseen forces could overturn power, wealth, or happiness in an instant. As night deepens and we picture these thin sheets of lead, folded and buried, it is easy to imagine the quiet desperation of the hand that carved them. A lover betrayed, a gambler ruined, a citizen cheated. Each one hoped their words, inscribed in metal, would pierce the silence of the underworld and return as fate itself. But curses, for all their mystery, were not the only hidden threat in Rome. For alongside them, the city carried another legacy of shadows, secrets buried not in lead, but in stone and blood. Catacombs stretched beneath the city, labyrinths of the dead and the living, where whispers of faith and fear mingled. And it is there, in those underground passages, that our story now descends. Beneath the grand avenues and marble facades of Rome lies another city, one hidden from the light of day. It is a city carved not for the living, but for the dead, a labyrinth of narrow tunnels, chambers, and crypts known as the catacombs. To walk there even in thought is to feel the weight of silence pressing close, the air heavy with centuries of memory. These underground passages, stretching for miles beneath the eternal city, were once the resting places of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, whose names have long since faded. And yet, In their darkness, Rome's forgotten still speak. The catacombs were born of necessity. As Rome expanded, so too did its population, and with it, the need for burial grounds. Land above ground was costly and scarce, particularly near the city. For many, the answer lay below. Soft volcanic rock, known as tufa, could be easily carved, creating endless networks of burial chambers that spread outward like veins beneath the earth. Families would purchase spaces in these underground cemeteries, their loved ones laid to rest in niches carved into the walls, sealed with slabs inscribed with names, prayers, or simple symbols. But the catacombs were more than practical. They became places of identity, of community, of faith. Among the most famous are the Christian catacombs, where the earliest followers of Christ buried their dead. In an empire where their faith was often viewed with suspicion, even hostility, these underground chambers provided a sacred refuge. On the walls, they painted symbols: the fish, the anchor, the shepherd carrying a lamb. These were not just decorations, but coded affirmations of belief, messages meant to endure in secrecy. To walk those corridors was to step into a hidden world of quiet devotion, lit by the flicker of oil lamps and echoing with whispered prayers. Yet the catacombs were not solely Christian. Pagans and Jews alike carved their own spaces beneath the earth, each group bringing their traditions into the shadowed depths. Here, the lines between communities sometimes blurred, their niches standing side by side in the rock, a silent testimony to the diversity of the ancient city. In this way, the catacombs reflected the true Rome, not the Rome of emperors and senators, but of ordinary families, craftsmen, and slaves, each seeking dignity in death. There is a haunting paradox to the catacombs. They were places of rest, yet they also became places of fear. By day, they held the sacred memory of ancestors. By night, they inspired unease, for darkness invites imagination, and imagination calls forth shadows. Ancient rumors told of spirits wandering those underground holes, of ghosts who whispered to the living. Some Romans believed that to disturb the dead was to invite curses, and so the catacombs gained an aura of dread as much as reverence. Even in later centuries, travelers who ventured below wrote of the unsettling quiet, the claustrophobic tunnels, the way a flickering torch could turn the shadows into specters. In these labyrinths, history itself lingers. The inscriptions on the walls reveal not only names but fragments of stories. Some are simple: a husband mourning his wife, a parent grieving a child. Others are poetic, prayers for peace or lines of hope in the face of mortality. Still others bear curses against grave robbers, stern warnings that those who disturb the resting place will find no rest themselves. In these words, we hear the voices of Rome's forgotten, ordinary people whose lives might otherwise have passed unnoticed in the shadow of empires. And what of those who enter the catacombs not in mourning, but in search of secrecy? For there are whispers that these underground spaces serve another role, as meeting places for the persecuted. Early Christians, hunted by imperial decree, may have gathered in hidden chambers, celebrating their rites in silence, concealed beneath the city. Historians still debate how often this truly happened, but the image endures. Small groups of believers huddled in the candlelight, their prayers echoing among the tombs, defying the power above them with the quiet strength of faith. Even centuries later, the catacombs continued to inspire both reverence and mystery. Pilgrims ventured into their depths, seeking connection with the martyrs buried there. Relics were taken from the tombs, carried to distant lands as symbols of sanctity and power. In some cases, the remains of those long dead were said to perform miracles, their bones becoming treasures of devotion. The catacombs thus became not just resting places, but sources of spiritual authority, their silence transformed into voices that shaped faith for generations. Yet for all their sanctity, the catacombs remain unsettling. Their endless corridors twist and branch, often indistinguishable one from another. Without a guide, it is easy to become lost, swallowed by the earth itself. Imagine wandering there by torchlight, every passage looking the same, the air damp, the silence broken only by the drip of unseen water. The living could vanish as easily as the dead, their footsteps fading into eternity. This is the dual nature of the catacombs, at once sacred and fearful, places of peace and of dread. They remind us that Rome's grandeur was not only above ground in marble and sunlight, but also below, in darkness and stone, where the ordinary sought the same eternity as the emperors. And though time has passed, though the city above has changed, the catacombs remain, holding their secrets, waiting in silence. As we leave these shadowed corridors in our minds, we return to the surface with a sense of unease. The dead of Rome whisper still, but the city above was no less haunted. For beyond its tombs, Rome was a place of strange creatures, of omens, and a beast that walked the line between myth and reality. And it is to those creatures, the monsters of Rome, that our story now turns. In the daylight, Rome seemed a city of order and majesty. Its marble temples gleamed in the sun, its armies marched with discipline, and its laws promised structure to a sprawling empire. But when the sun sank below the horizon and shadows crept across the narrow alleys, the imagination of Rome told a different story. In whispers passed from parent to child, in tales exchanged around hearths, Rome was haunted by monsters. They were not merely creatures of distant myth, but beings believed to wander among men, blurring the boundary between the real and the unreal. The Romans inherited much of their monstrous lore from the Greeks, but they added their own layers of fear. Stories of Lamii, female demons who preyed upon children, were repeated in hushed tones, warnings as much as tales. Strigi, vampiric witches said to feast on the blood of infants, flitted through Roman imagination. These creatures were not confined to the realm of epic poetry. They lingered in the minds of ordinary Romans, their presence used to explain sudden illness, misfortune, or the eerie cries of the night. Perhaps most infamous was a werewolf, or versipellis, literally skin changer. Romans believed that certain men, through curses or strange rites, could transform into wolves, wandering the countryside under the moon. Patrones, in his Satyricon, tells of a soldier who stripped off his clothes and transformed into a beast before the eyes of his companion. Such tales carried both horror and fascination. For a society that valued order, the idea of a man losing his shape, his reason, and his humanity was deeply unsettling. The werewolf was a reminder that beneath the veneer of civilization, something wild and uncontrollable always lurked. Other monsters were tied more directly to Rome's landscapes. Marshes and rivers, with their shifting mists, were thought to harbor spirits and strange beasts. The sea brought tales of tritons and nereids, beings half human and half creature, messengers of storms and omens of doom. Travelers returning from distant provinces spoke of foreign monsters, giant serpents in Africa, strange hybrid beasts in the east. Stories that expanded the Roman sense of a world filled with wonders and terrors. Yet monsters were not only animals or demons. They could also be omens. A child born with deformities was sometimes regarded as a monstrous sign, a message from the gods warning of disaster. Livy and other historians record such events as portents, noting with grave seriousness when a two-headed calf or malformed child appeared. In these moments, the monstrous became a language of fate, an unsettling bridge between the human and the divine. In literature, monsters served another role. They reflected human fears. The poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, filled Rome's imagination with stories of transformation. Men and women turned into beasts, stones, or trees. These myths were not idle entertainment. They suggested that identity was fragile, that beneath the surface, one could always be changed into something other. In this way, monsters mirrored Rome's anxieties about control, power, and the unknown. But what makes the monsters of Rome most fascinating is how close they felt to daily life. Unlike the distant dragons of medieval legend, these creatures were woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. A mother warning her child not to wander at night might invoke the striga. A farmer who lost livestock to wolves might whisper of a versipellis roaming nearby. Even educated men, senators, and poets spoke of such beings with a seriousness that tells us they were more than entertainment. They were explanations, coping mechanisms for the inexplicable. And beneath the fear lay something deeper, fascination. Romans were drawn to the monstrous, much as we are today. They decorated their art with grotesque masks, carved images of hybrid beasts into their mosaics, and filled their literature with transformations and terrors. To confront the monstrous was to acknowledge the thin line between civilization and chaos, between order and disorder, between the known and the unknowable. Imagine walking home through Rome's dimly lit streets, the only light coming from flickering torches. Shadows stretch against the walls, turning ordinary shapes into menacing forms. From an alley comes the sound of an animal's cry, perhaps a dog, perhaps something else. Your steps quicken. You pass shrines at the crossroads, where offerings are left to ward off spirits. Every corner carries a question. Every sound carries a possibility. In this atmosphere, monsters were not just stories. They were felt presences, woven into the very experience of the city at night. Even the empire's vast arenas became stages for monstrosity. Exotic animals, lions, crocodiles, even elephants, were brought to Rome from distant lands, paraded before the public as living proof of Rome's dominion over the natural world. But to the spectators, these creatures must have felt almost supernatural, embodiments of a wildness beyond Roman control. When gladiators fought beasts in the Colosseum, it was more than spectacle. It was a ritual confrontation with the monstrous, a symbolic taming of chaos by Roman order. Yet in the blood and roar, one wonders, did the Romans truly feel mastery, or did they feel the thrill of standing face to face with what they could never fully conquer? And so the monsters of Rome were everywhere, on the edges of stories, in the corners of streets, in the very heart of their imagination. They were both feared and celebrated, despised and adored. They allowed Romans to name their anxieties, to give form to the shadows that lay just beyond the firelight. But monsters, for all their terror, were only one way that Rome confronted the unknown. The empire was also a city of omens, of visions, of prophecies that whispered of destinies yet to come. If monsters embodied chaos, omens promised order, a way to read the will of the gods and the patterns of the world. And so, as our journey continues, we leave behind the beasts of shadow and step into the realm of prophecy, where Rome sought guidance in the mysterious language of signs. From the earliest days of the Roman Republic to the final decline of the empire, prophecy held a power that was both revered and feared. Rome was a city that prided itself on order, on law, and on military discipline. Yet beneath this structured surface lay a restless dependence on signs, omens, and predictions of the future. The Romans believed that the will of the gods was always present, always speaking, if only one knew how to read the messages. And these messages were not whispers of comfort. They were often warnings, predictions of doom, or veiled hints of great upheavals to come. One of the most mysterious collections of prophecy was the Sibylline books, sacred texts that had been offered to King Tarquin the Proud by a strange, aged woman. According to legend, she first asked a high price for 9 books of prophecy. When the king refused, she burned 3, then offered the remaining 6 for the same cost. Again, he refused, and again she burned 3. Finally, when only 3 remained, the king relented and bought them at the original price. These surviving books, kept under guard in the Temple of Jupiter, became one of Rome's most treasured yet dangerous possessions. Consulted only in times of crisis, they were believed to contain divine guidance, though the messages were cryptic and unsettling. Their very existence was a reminder that Rome's destiny was not entirely in human hands, but in the mysterious will of fate. Prophecy also came from individuals, strange figures who seemed to straddle the line between madness and inspiration. The Sibyl of Cumae, a prophetess said to live for 1,000 years or a body withered to dust, was one such figure. Virgil, in his Aeneid, describes a terrifying presence, her body trembling as the god Apollo seized her voice to deliver visions of the future. Her words were wild, fragmented, and often dark, leaving listeners both awed and unsettled. It was through her that Aeneas, Rome's legendary founder, was said to have glimpsed the trials that awaited his people. In this way, prophecy was woven into the very myth of Rome's beginning. It was not just a superstition of the people, but part of the grand story of the city itself. The Romans also looked to the skies for messages. A strange eclipse, a comet streaking across the heavens, a thunderclap at an unexpected moment. All could be read as omens. Perhaps the most famous was the appearance of a comet after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Many believed it to be the soul of Caesar ascending to the heavens, proof of his divine nature. Others feared it as a sign that the order of Rome itself had been torn apart. In either case, the night sky became not just a backdrop to history, but an active participant, its stars and flames shaping the way Romans understood their world. Some prophecies seemed almost designed to haunt. The legend of the prophecy of the 12 vultures, for instance, was tied to the very founding of Rome. According to tradition, Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who fought for the right to build the city, sought guidance from the gods through augury, the reading of birds. Romulus claimed to see 12 vultures, a sign of divine favor, while Remus saw fewer. The omen sealed Romulus's fate as a founder of Rome, but also foreshadowed the blood he would spill, including the killing of his own brother. In this way, the The prophecy was both a blessing and a curse, a promise of greatness that carried within it the seed of tragedy. Throughout Rome's history, prophecies often carried a tone of doom. During the Punic Wars, for example, strange births, meteor showers, and earthquakes were recorded as warnings from the gods. In the later empire, Christian and pagan prophets alike spoke of decline, of an end that seemed unavoidable. These words did not fade into the background. They were repeated, recorded, and feared. A prophecy could weigh heavily on the minds of leaders, shaping decisions and fueling paranoia. If a seer predicted betrayal, suspicion spread like wildfire. If an oracle spoke of invasion, generals sharpened their swords even before the enemy appeared. But prophecy was never clear. It thrived in ambiguity, its messages cloaked in riddles. One tale speaks of the oracle who warned that a king of Rome would fall if he crossed a certain river. The leader who heard it believed it meant victory for him and disaster for his rival. Yet when the prophecy was fulfilled, it was he who perished. In this uncertainty lay prophecy's true power. No matter the outcome, the words could be interpreted to fit, always reminding the listener that fate was larger than human understanding. For the ordinary Roman, prophecy seeped into daily life as well. Fortune tellers in marketplaces, inscriptions on charms, and whispered predictions in households gave shape to hopes and fays. Even the humblest farmer looked for omens in the behavior of animals or the patterns of the weather. The world was alive with meaning, every detailed potential message. To live in Rome was to live in a constant dialogue with destiny. Yet this dialogue was never one of peace. Prophecies lingered like shadows over the city, whispering of disasters and betrayals that could not be avoided. They haunted not just the imagination of the people, but the very halls of power. The Senate itself could be shaken by a prophecy, as if the words of a seer carried more weight than the decrees of the greatest men. In this way, prophecy held a quiet but persistent grip on Rome's fate, a reminder that no empire, however mighty, could escape the unseen hand of destiny. And so, as Rome sought to understand its place in the world, it turned always to the voices of prophecy, voices that spoke of both glory and ruin. They were guides and warnings, comfort and torment. They gave the Romans a sense that history was not random, but written in advance, etched into the fabric of the cosmos. Yet at the same time, they filled every step with unease, for to know the future was also to fear it. But if prophecy was the voice of the gods, Rome also sought to hear directly from the restless dead. For behind the oracles and signs lay another, darker source of knowledge, the whispers that rose from graves, the voices of ancestors, and the belief that the dead themselves might offer guidance or vengeance. And so, from prophecy, we move to the realm of the departed, where Rome's fascination with death shaped rituals both sacred and unsettling. Death in ancient Rome was never silent. Though the body might lie still, the Romans believed that the voice of the departed lingered, sometimes in memory, sometimes in dreams, and sometimes in ways far more unsettling. The city of Rome was alive with the presence of its dead, not only in the crowded cemeteries that lined its roads, but also in the whispers that seemed to seep from tombs, ashes, and shadows. To the Romans, death was not a final ending but a threshold, and those who crossed it retained a voice that could still be heard, if one dared to listen. Roman funerary customs reveal much about this uneasy relationship with the dead. Families placed coins in the mouths of the deceased, a payment for Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx. Without this coin, it was feared the soul would wander, restless and unable to reach the afterlife. They also performed rituals of libation, pouring wine, milk, or honey onto graves so that the spirits would not feel neglected. To forget the dead, or to deny them offerings, was dangerous. A neglected spirit could become a lemur, a restless ghost, whispering curses into the ears of the living or appearing in terrifying dreams. These fears gave rise to the festival of Lemuria, one of Rome's most haunting traditions. Each May, households performed rites to appease the dead. At midnight, the head of the family would rise, walk barefoot through the home, and cast black beans behind him. As he did so, he would chant words meant to drive away the shades. The beans, it was believed, were irresistible to the dead, who gathered them up and departed. The ritual ended with a clashing of bronze, loud noises meant to scatter any lingering spirits. Even in their most solemn festivals, the Romans treated death as something both intimate and threatening, a force that had to be respected lest it grow dangerous. Yet the whispers of the dead were not always fearful. The Romans also believed their ancestors could offer guidance, protection, and wisdom. Household shrines called lares were dedicated to ancestral spirits, who were honored with offerings of food and wine. These spirits were not ominous ghosts but guardians of the family, watching over the home. Still, the line between a benevolent ancestor and a restless shade was thin. If forgotten, even a protective spirit could become vengeful. To live in Rome was to live always aware of the gaze of the dead, a gaze that demanded memory and devotion. Literature and legend preserved many tales of the dead returning to speak. The historian Suetonius recorded ominous dreams and ghostly visitations that seemed to predict the fall of emperors. The poet Lucan, in his Pharsalia, wrote of necromancers who could summon the voices of the departed, forcing them to reveal the fates of the living. These stories blurred the boundary between the natural and the supernatural, suggesting that the dead were never truly gone, only hidden behind a veil that might be lifted by ritual or accident. Dreams were another place where whispers of the dead were often heard. Many Romans believed that spirits could enter the dreams of the living, carrying messages or warnings. Some sought these visions intentionally, sleeping on tombs in hopes of hearing a voice. To the modern mind, this may seem unsettling, but to the Romans it was a way of connecting with forces larger than themselves. The dead, after all, had already crossed into the realm of mystery, and their voices carried knowledge that the living could not possess. One of the most chilling beliefs was that of the unburied dead. A soldier lost in battle, his body left to decay on a distant field, was feared to become a tormented shade. Without proper burial rites, his soul wandered, whispering its grief into the night. Families went to great lengths to recover the remains of loved ones, even when it meant crossing war zones, because the thought of a relative whispering in endless unrest was unbearable. The unburied dead were the most insistent, their whispers growing into cries that haunted not just individuals but entire communities. There are also accounts of apparitions that terrified even the powerful. Pliny the Younger, in one of his letters, tells of a philosopher in Athens who rented a house haunted by the ghost of an old man. The spirit appeared bound in chains, rattling through the halls. The philosopher, instead of fleeing, followed the ghost and discovered a buried skeleton, long forgotten. Once given proper burial, the haunting ceased. Stories like this spread through Roman society, reinforcing the belief that the dead could not rest until honored, and that their whispers were calls for remembrance. The whispers of the dead also carried political weight. Omens tied to restless spirits were sometimes interpreted as warnings of upheaval. Before great battles or shift in power, there were reports of ghostly voices in the night, of crowds hearing cries that seemed to come from nowhere. Whether these were real experiences, echoes of fear, or manipulations by those in power, they fed into Rome's sense that history itself was haunted. In Rome, the divine was never far from the ordinary. The city's people believed that the gods were present in every aspect of life, watching, judging, and sometimes intervening. Yet their messages were rarely clear. They came not as proclamations or written decrees, but as subtle signs woven into the natural and human worlds. To interpret these omens was to navigate a complex language of symbols, a skill both feared and revered. For the Romans, understanding the will of the gods could mean the difference between triumph and disaster, between prosperity and ruin. Perhaps the most familiar form of omen was the flight of birds, or augury. The Romans believed that birds carried messages from the divine, their patterns in the sky signaling approval or warning. Augurs, trained interpreters of these signs, would observe the direction, number, and behavior of birds before battles, public decisions, and even personal matters. A single crow circling in the wrong direction or a flock of geese taking flight could provoke anxiety or inspire immediate action. The city itself was alive with this vigilance, every chirp and flutter potential communication from the gods. But birds were not the only conveyors of divine will. Thunder and lightning, earthquakes, comets, and eclipses were all read as messages, omens of power, anger, or approval. A sudden storm might indicate that a particular plan was doomed, while an unexpected calm could signal the gods' favor. The historian Livy records numerous instances when magistrates halted military campaigns or delayed political decisions after observing such natural signs, demonstrating how deeply these omens penetrated the heart of Roman governance. Sacrificial rituals were another method of divining the gods' will. Animals, sheep, bulls, and birds, were offered and their entrails examined. The shape of the liver, the color of blood, even the manner in which the animal fell could communicate approval or warning. These rituals, known as haruspicy, were highly technical, demanding years of training and strict adherence to tradition. To misinterpret a sign was to risk catastrophe. A general who ignored a negative omen could lose an entire army, and a consul who dismissed a warning could face political ruin or even death. Yet omens were not always precise. They were symbols, and symbols are open to interpretation. The same lightning strike that one augur read as divine favor might be interpreted by another as a warning. This ambiguity gave rise to a strange tension in Rome. The gods were always speaking, but their words were not always easy to understand. Political leaders, aware of this uncertainty, could use omens to manipulate perception, claiming divine backing for their decisions while casting doubt on their rivals. Omens were both sacred and strategic. Even the most personal events could carry divine significance. A dream, a sudden illness, or an accident could be read as an omen if it occurred at a pivotal moment. Stories abound of emperors and generals interpreting minor events as messages from the heavens. Augustus, for instance, reportedly attributed his rise and consolidation of power to favorable omens, interpreting birds, celestial phenomena, and even everyday coincidences as signs of divine approval. The god's influence was thought to extend into every choice, every action, every heartbeat of the empire. Omens also shaped the city's response to crises. During plagues, famines, or wars, priests and magistrates would consult the gods through ritual and interpretation, seeking to understand the meaning behind misfortune. They might fast, pray, or make offerings to appease divine wrath, believing that human suffering often had a spiritual cause. In this way, omens became a lens through which the Romans understood chaos and sought to restore order. Some omens were so dramatic that they became legends. The great comet after Julius Caesar's death, the appearance of a monstrous birth, or the haunting cries of animals before battles, all were interpreted as messages from the gods. Ordinary citizens, soldiers, and senators alike took these signs seriously, often changing plans, delaying actions, or performing additional rituals to align themselves with divine will. In Rome, the sacred and the mundane were inseparable. The city itself was a stage on which the gods spoke constantly. Yet omens carried a paradoxical power. They could comfort and terrify simultaneously. A favorable omen might reassure a leader, giving confidence and courage. A negative omen, however, could cast a shadow over the brightest triumph, a reminder that human ambition was always subject to forces beyond comprehension. This tension between knowledge and uncertainty, between divine guidance and unpredictable fate, permeated every aspect of Roman life. In essence, the Romans lived in a world filled with meaning, where no coincidence was accidental and no event without significance. They believed that the gods' eyes were ever upon them, that the natural world was a book to be read, and that omens were the punctuation of divine speech. This belief gave life a rhythm of caution, reflection, and ritual, where every decision might be influenced by whispers from above. As we reflect on these omens, it becomes clear that Rome was a city in constant dialogue with the unseen. The gods whispered, birds circled, lightning struck, and the restless dead murmured in shadowed tombs. All these elements, monsters, prophesies, whispers, and signs, combined to shape a civilization profoundly aware of the thin boundary between the known and the unknown. Rome thrived in light, yet it was the dark, the mysterious, and the hidden that gave a city its most enduring power and fascination. From the heavens to the earth, from the living to the dead, the Romans sought to understand a world governed by forces larger than themselves. Yet even as they interpreted signs and performed rituals, they could not escape the inevitability of mortality. And it is mortality, intertwined with mystery and history, that leads us to our next exploration, the private fears and hidden horrors that existed behind the grandeur of Rome's streets and palaces. Rome, to the casual observer, was a city of astonishing grandeur. Its streets bustled with merchants, artisans, senators, and slaves. Markets overflowed with fruit, fish, and wine. Triumphal arches celebrated victories, and emperors paraded through forums beneath the gaze of marble statues. But beneath this veneer of civilization, the daily life of ordinary Romans was threaded with a subtle, pervasive horror, a quiet awareness that danger, decay, and death lurked even in the most familiar routines. Disease was an ever-present companion. Without modern sanitation, the crowded streets and aqueduct-fed fountains became breeding grounds for infection. Typhus, dysentery, and other deadly illnesses swept through the city with frightening speed. Mortality was high, particularly among infants who were vulnerable to malnutrition and disease. Families lived in constant fear that a child, spouse, or parent might be struck down at any moment. The bustling vibrancy of the markets and forums could never fully mask the shadow of sickness that hovered over the city like a persistent fog. Food, too, carried hidden risks. The Romans prized delicacies such as oysters, dormice, and fermented fish sauce, but without refrigeration, spoilage was common. Poison, whether intentional or accidental, was an ever-present concern. Wealthy citizens could afford elaborate banquets and tasters to protect themselves, but the poor were often at the mercy of whatever was available, its safety uncertain. A meal might nourish or it might silently steal life, echoing the darker patterns of intrigue seen in the palaces of power. Fire was another constant threat. Rome's dense urban landscape, filled with wooden homes and open hearths, was vulnerable to rapid conflagration. Entire insulae or apartment blocks could be engulfed in flames within minutes, trapping residents in a nightmarish dance of smoke and heat. Even the wealthy were not immune. Accounts tell of fires sweeping through grand houses, consuming treasures, manuscripts, and the lives of servants and family alike. The threat of fire hung over the city in a quiet, almost invisible way, shaping behavior, architecture, and daily routines. Crime, though less chronicled than in modern urban centers, was still a source of fear. Pickpockets and thieves operated in crowded markets, while more organized bandits lurked on the roads beyond the city. But the greatest danger often came from those closest to power. Neighbors, servants, and even family members could betray trust for wealth, influence, or revenge. Rome was a city in which vigilance was essential. Even the familiar could be a source of hidden menace. Slavery added another layer of horror to everyday life. A significant portion of Rome's population lived in bondage, often enduring brutal labor, abuse, and deprivation. The slave suffering was invisible to the casual observer, yet it was woven into the rhythms of the city, fueling the wealth and leisure of others. Revolts, though rare, reminded the elite that the oppressed were never completely silent. The fear of sudden rebellion, combined with moral unease, created a tension that existed beneath the surface of daily life. Religion, too, carried its own shadows. While festivals, temples, and sacrifices celebrated the divine, the devout also believed that neglecting rituals or angering the gods could result in calamity. Omens were everywhere, and interpreting them incorrectly could have serious consequences. A misread bird, a forgotten offering, a miscalculated ritual. Any of these could bring misfortune, subtly reinforcing a pervasive sense that danger lurked even in acts meant to honor the divine. Perhaps most unsettling was the knowledge of mortality itself. Romans lived with death as a constant presence. Funeral processions passed through streets filled with life. Tombs lined the roads leading out of the city, and the catacombs below reminded everyone that beneath the vibrant city lay an entire world of the dead. Mourning was public yet deeply personal, a reminder that life was fragile, fleeting, and often cruelly interrupted. The very architecture of Rome, with its monuments and memorials, was a testament not only to achievement but also to the inevitability of loss. Even leisure held hidden anxieties. The Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, and public baths were centers of entertainment and social life, yet there were also spaces where danger and spectacle intertwined. Gladiators fought to the death, exotic beasts roamed arenas, and crowds often became instruments of chaos in moments of panic. Public baths, though places of relaxation, were crowded and unsanitary, breeding illness and occasional violent encounters. Pleasure and peril coexisted constantly, a reminder that the pursuit of leisure was never entirely safe. The psychological weight of living amidst such constant risks cannot be overstated. Romans were simultaneously resilient and anxious, celebrating life's abundance while remaining acutely aware of its fragility. Superstitions, rituals, and careful attention to omens became coping mechanisms, ways to exert control in a world that offered little security. In this sense, the hidden horrors of daily life were not merely physical. They were mental, shaping the thoughts, behaviors, and fears of an entire civilization. Yet even as fear and danger permeated daily existence, Romans found moments of beauty, joy, and human connection. Families gathered, festivals brought color and music, and the city's culture of art, literature, and philosophy flourished. This contrast, between vibrant life above ground and pervasive threat beneath the surface, defined Rome's unique character. It was a civilization acutely aware of mortality and mystery, balancing celebration with vigilance, light with darkness. In contemplating these hidden horrors, we gain a fuller understanding of Rome. The grandeur of its monuments and the sweep of its history are inseparable from the quiet dangers that shape daily life. Disease, crime, fire, slavery, divine wrath, and the omnipresence of death created a shadowed backdrop for the city's achievements. To walk through Rome, in imagination or history, is to see both the shining facades and the lurking terrors that gave life its weight and urgency. And so, having explored the quiet fears that accompanied every Roman day, we now turn to the most intimate and haunting mysteries of all, the private obsessions, secret experiments, and personal horrors that shaped Rome's elite, where ambition, curiosity, and darkness intertwine in ways that history barely dares to record. Beneath the marble columns, gilded frescoes, and bustling forums of Rome, there existed a world reserved for the privileged few, a world of whispered intrigues, secret desires, and obsessions hidden from public eyes. The elite lived in palaces that dazzled the senses, yet behind those grand walls, darkness thrived. The senators, magistrates, and wealthy patricians who shaped the empire were not only masters of politics and power, but also practitioners of hidden arts, collectors of forbidden knowledge, and participants in private rituals that blended curiosity with danger. One of the most striking aspects of elite life was their fascination with the supernatural. While common Romans sought guidance from omens and rituals, the wealthy often commissioned private diviners, astrologers, and magicians to uncover truths that might otherwise remain hidden. These advisors could predict the outcome of battles, forecast political shifts, or identify rivals' weaknesses. Sometimes, these practices ventured into areas that skirted legality or morality. Secrets were currency, and knowledge of fate, or the ability to manipulate it, was among the most valuable possessions in Rome. Luxury itself became a stage for subtle horrors. Wealthy Romans indulged in elaborate banquets, replete with exotic foods and intoxicating wines. Some experimented with poisons, not merely as a threat, but as a means of testing or demonstrating control. The infamous poisoning of political rivals was a recurring motif in the annals of Roman history, reminding citizens that even the most opulent tables could harbor death. In this environment, curiosity and caution were intertwined. The pursuit of pleasure and knowledge could easily become perilous. Art and collection also concealed secret obsessions. Villas were adorned with statues, mosaics, and paintings, some depicting mythological horrors or grotesque forms. Wealthy Romans commissioned art not only to impress visitors but also to explore ideas considered scandalous or esoteric. Certain images were intended for private contemplation, objects through which the elite could confront mortality, desire, and power in symbolic form. These private worlds were a counterpoint to the public displays of wealth, a shadow life of thought and imagination where conventional morality was quietly suspended. Some elites engaged directly in experimental practices that straddled the line between science, superstition, and cruelty. Knowledge of herbs, poisons, and remedies was intertwined with secrecy, as experimenting with life and death could yield both insight and scandal. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge, whether in the form of early medicine, mystical studies, or the testing of human limits, was both a status symbol and a psychological indulgence. These hidden experiments often occurred in private chambers or secluded villas, far from prying eyes, reinforcing the sense that Rome's true mysteries were concealed behind layers of privilege. The darker aspect of elite secrecy extended to the human psyche. Personal obsessions, power, control, revenge, or forbidden desire often drove actions that were carefully hidden from public. Historical accounts hint at conspiracies, clandestine gatherings, and alliances that operated in the shadows of official politics. Senators might conspire to remove rivals through means both mundane and arcane. Wealthy families sometimes used private punishments or psychological manipulation to maintain dominance. In every case, secrecy amplified power, creating a landscape where appearances masked intentions, and every interaction carried the weight of unseen schemes. Religion, too, was often practiced in private, taking forms that diverged from the public rituals observed in temples. The elite could commission hidden shrines, perform personal sacrifices, or engage in rites intended to secure influence, wealth, or protection. These practices were rarely shared openly, for exposure could bring scandal or legal consequences. Yet they reveal a central truth about Rome. Power was inseparable from mystery. Those who could access hidden knowledge, who could navigate shadows unseen, often commanded not only wealth but also influence over destiny itself. Perhaps most chilling of all was the elite's relationship with mortality. While ordinary Romans feared death and sought to appease the restless dead, the wealthy often confronted it with both fascination and defiance. Tombs were constructed not only as memorials but as statements of enduring legacy, monuments meant to outlast time itself. Some elites engaged in rituals designed to communicate with ancestors or to explore life beyond death. In private chambers, away from public eyes, they might experiment with substances, symbols, or rites intended to extend influence beyond the grave. Their fear of oblivion mingled with ambition, creating a shadowy realm of obsession and intrigue. These hidden practices of the elite remind us that Rome was not simply a city of law, architecture, and civic order. It was also a city where curiosity, ambition, and fear of the unknown coexisted in intricate, often disturbing ways. The public faced the grandeur of politics and entertainment, while the private world of the powerful contained mysteries far darker, secrets that were rarely recorded openly, surviving only in whispers, anecdote, or archaeological traces. In imagining these hidden chambers, one can picture a room lit by flickering oil lamps, walls adorned with intricate mosaics, and shelves lined with objects both beautiful and ominous. A patrician consults a tablet, a poisoned goblet rests on the table, and faint chants echo from a hidden shrine. Every detail is designed to impress, intimidate, or illuminate, yet all is shrouded in secrecy. This is a Rome that thrived beneath the city's public face, a world where ambition and fear intertwined, creating mysteries that would endure long after the people themselves had vanished. As night falls over the ancient streets of Rome, it is easy to imagine the city in a quiet, almost sacred hush. The marble monuments, the grand arches, the forums echoing with the ghosts of speeches long silenced, all lie under a blanket of mystery, inviting reflection on what it meant to live in a city where grandeur and darkness existed side by side. Rome's history is not merely the story of emperors and conquests, but a tapestry woven with shadow, the silent fears, the whispered secrets, and the hidden terrors that shaped every life, from the humblest citizen to the most powerful patrician. The city's darkness was not only physical but psychological. Citizens walked streets where danger and wonder mingled, where death was an intimate companion, and the unknown lurked in every corner. The catacombs below, the monsters of myth, and the omens in sky and earth remind us that Rome was as much a city of imagination and fear as it was of marble and empire. Life was fragile, and yet the people of Rome carried on with remarkable resilience, balancing awe and anxiety with rituals, art, and devotion. In reflecting on these shadows, one begins to see a city alive with contrasts, light and dark, order and chaos, knowledge and mystery. Romans sought to impose structure through law, architecture, and ritual, yet they acknowledged the limits of human control. The whispers of the dead, the prophecies of seers, and the omens of the gods all underscored a profound truth, that life is threaded with uncertainty, and that understanding often comes in fragments rather than clarity. This delicate tension gave the city its texture, its haunting allure, and its enduring fascination. The hidden horrors of daily life, disease, fire, crime, and mortality served as reminders that beauty and peril coexist. Even in the bustle of markets or the splendor of a villa, the risk of loss or danger was never far. The elite, with their secret obsessions, demonstrated that ambition and curiosity often walk hand in hand with fear, and that the human desire to know, control, or transcend is timeless. Through their private rituals, experiments, and contemplations of mortality, they reveal a city that thrived on both light and shadow, a civilization acutely aware of the fragility and mystery of existence. Rome's monsters, both real and imagined, speak to a collective fear of the unknown, a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than human understanding. The Lamii, Strigi, and werewolves may have been stories, yet they reflected genuine anxieties, the vulnerability of children, the fragility of safety, and the consequences of unchecked power. These tales, whispered across generations, remind us that imagination and fear are as ancient as the city itself, shaping behavior, belief, and culture. Prophecies, omens, and whispers of the dead show a civilization attempting to listen to forces beyond itself. The Sibylline books, the flight of birds, lightning strikes, and restless spirits all provided a framework for understanding the unpredictable. In observing these signs, Romans sought to navigate the uncertain currents of fate, blending ritual, devotion, and interpretation into a way of life. The interplay between human action and perceived divine will create a city constantly aware of itself in relation to a larger, often inscrutable universe. As we step back from the layers of history, we see that Rome's darkness is inseparable from its light. Its grandeur, the triumphal arches, the temples, the forums, was built atop human complexity, fear, curiosity, devotion, and obsession. The city was a living organism, its pulse shaped as much by the unknown as by the visible, by the whispers of the dead as by the shouts of the living. To walk through Rome, even in imagination, is to experience a city where every shadow tells a story, every silence carries meaning, and every stone bears witness to both glory and mystery. In contemplating these shadows, there is a quiet lesson for us today. Rome's mysteries remind us that the unknown is not merely to be feared but to be acknowledged, that human experience is enriched by the tension between what is seen and what is hidden. The city's enduring fascination lies not only in its architecture or military might, but in the intimate, often unsettling, textures of life itself, the whispered secrets, the prophetic signs, and the haunting presence of what lies beneath. As we drift through these reflections, it becomes clear that Rome's story is not simply one of history, it is a meditation on the human condition. We are drawn to the city not only because of its accomplishments, but because it mirrors our own curiosity, our own fears, and our own desire to understand what cannot be fully known. The shadows of Rome are, in a sense, universal. They echo in every city, in every era, in every mind that seeks to balance light and dark, certainty and mystery. And so, as we close this exploration, we leave Rome not as a city frozen in time, but as a living memory of human imagination, resilience, and wonder. Its darkness was never merely absence of light. It was a presence in itself, a companion to life, a mirror to the human soul, and an invitation to contemplate the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of understanding. In the silence of night, we can almost hear the echoes of the city's shadows, whispers of the dead, rustle of leaves over tombs, flicker of candlelight in private chambers, and the distant roar of unseen beasts. Rome's mysteries endure, not as horrors to repel, but as invitations to wonder, to reflect, and to dream. And so, beneath the eternal sky, we remember, history is alive not only in monuments and texts, but in the quiet shadows that give meaning, depth, and poetry to the human story. Rome, in all its light and darkness, continues to speak to those who listen patiently, attentively, and with an open heart.